3 minutes ago, something unthinkable happens in the most symbolic place of all. Camilla expects access to Westminster Abbey routine, assured, unquestioned. But Prince Edward denies it, not with a public confrontation, with a quiet, decisive refusal that sends a tremor through palace and clergy alike. Because the Abbey isn't just a building, it's legitimacy in stone. And if Edward is willing to close that door to Camilla, it means there's a reason so serious the monarchy would rather risk scandal than surrender control. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the world doesn't see it. There are no cameras catching a shove, no raised voices echoing under ancient arches. Instead, it spreads the way real panic always spreads in royal circles through urgent whispers, clipped phone calls, and sudden changes in security posture that don't get explained, only obeyed. Clergy are alerted with language that feels unusually formal, unusually cautious. Doors that are typically opened with reverence are suddenly treated like assets. Protocols shift. Access lists are rechecked. A few names that normally glide through without question are abruptly flagged for confirmation. And when that happens inside an institution built on tradition, it's not just a decision. It's a signal that someone believes the ground is no longer stable. Westminster Abbey isn't simply a place of worship. In the royal universe, it's the stone spine of legitimacy, where vows become dynastic promises, where crowns become history, where the monarchy borrows the gravity of centuries and wraps it around itself like armor. Being welcomed there is not only spiritual, it is institutional acceptance. It tells the public, the clergy, the courtiers, and the foreign eyes watching from afar that this person belongs inside the story of the crown. So when Edward quietly refuses Camilla entry, when he chooses no in a place that rarely hears it, the message is brutal in its simplicity. Something about this visit risks more than embarrassment. It risks authority itself. And Edward's refusal doesn't feel like a petty power move. It feels protective. But protection in the royal family is never clean. It always comes with a shadow, because to protect something sacred, you sometimes have to admit it's under threat. And the moment you admit that, you create a war inside your own walls. Edward doesn't posture. He doesn't grandstand. That's what makes it chilling. He acts like a man carrying information he didn't ask for, like someone forced into the role of gatekeeper, because the alternative is catastrophe. A reluctant act of war dressed up as duty. The kind of duty that costs you allies. Camilla, meanwhile, doesn't arrive as a humble visitor seeking solace. There's a calculation to it, an expectation that the Abbey will serve as a stage, a symbol, a seal of belonging that cannot be argued with once the door opens. In the palace, people understand symbols better than they understand facts. A single image can bury 1,000 doubts, and that's what makes the timing feel sharp, almost predatory. This isn't spiritual, it's strategic. It's an attempt to stand in the legitimacy of stone, to borrow the authority of the sacred and make it impossible for anyone inside the system to challenge her without seeming disloyal to the institution itself. That is why the factions ignite so quickly. Courtiers start spinning. Clergy start asking questions they aren't supposed to ask. The royal household splits into camps not because they hate each other, but because they fear different outcomes. One side panics about the optics. We can't deny her. It looks like rejection. Another side panics about precedent. If we allow it, we grant something we can't take back. And a third side, smaller, colder, more dangerous, doesn't care how it looks at all. They care about what Edward knows. Because the only reason you lock down a sacred space is if you believe something inside it could be exposed, damaged, or used as leverage. And then comes the line Edward doesn't say loudly, but he says clearly enough that it freezes the air around him. He doesn't claim she can never enter. He doesn't accuse her of wrongdoing. He simply draws a boundary with words that feel like a warning, not a negotiation. Certain areas must remain protected. Certain spaces are not available. Certain paths are closed. That single phrase, certain areas, lands like a weight, because it implies the Abbey holds more than memorials and altars. It implies it holds something vulnerable, something sensitive, something that cannot survive a strategic visit. Camilla hears it as an insult. The clergy hear it as an unprecedented intrusion. The courtiers hear it as a crisis. But the most terrifying part is what Edward's tone suggests. He is not guessing. He is not improvising. He is enforcing, and in that enforcement is the first real hint of a split so deep, it doesn't just divide people, it divides loyalties, faith, and the very idea of who is allowed to stand near the crown's most sacred stones. And as the palace scrambles to frame it as scheduling, Edward's next words make it clear this wasn't logistics, it was a boundary. No one says power play inside a place like Westminster Abbey. They say tradition, they say custom, they say it would be appropriate. Camilla's request is presented as gentle, almost sacred, like a simple royal visit wrapped in velvet language and careful smiles. But Edward hears the pressure underneath the reverence, the insistence hiding behind courtesy. Because the moment Camilla is seen moving freely through the Abbey, it becomes a public signal that her authority is untouchable, her position spiritually blessed, and her legacy fused into the nation's most sacred royal space. The message doesn't arrive like a demand. That would be crude. It arrives the way the palace prefers to move through trusted clergy, familiar channels, and polite phrasing designed to feel inevitable. A call that sounds like a courtesy, an email that reads like a formality, a discreet nod from someone who usually only nods when the decision has already been made. The words are soft, but the shape is sharp. This would be appropriate. This would be wise. This would be well received. And in that gentle framing, Edward recognizes the oldest trick in royal politics: pressure, disguised as respect, obligation disguised as piety. Because once the Abbey becomes the backdrop, the story becomes fixed. It stops being about private doubts or whispered questions and becomes a public image that cannot be argued with. An image is not a debate. It's a verdict. The public doesn't measure what was said in private, they absorb what they see, and the Abbey is a kind of visual oath. If Camilla is shown there, moving as if she has always belonged, it tells the nation that the institution itself has sealed her into the crown's sacred narrative. It tells the courtiers that resistance is pointless. It tells the clergy that hesitation is disloyal. And it tells anyone watching from the edges of the family that the new order has been blessed by stone, silence, and centuries. That is why the intermediaries matter. Senior staff drift into the role of messenger, but not because they want to. Because they have been positioned there. They become bridges that turn into traps, a dean here, a private secretary there, a trusted figure who seems neutral until you realize neutrality is the weapon. They don't say, Camilla requires this. They say, it would mean so much. They don't say approve it. They say we simply need confirmation. And in those phrases, Edward hears the corner tightening. If he says yes, he grants permanence. If he says no, he becomes the man standing between the crown and its holiest symbol. Then comes the detail that changes everything: the implied urgency. It must be confirmed today. Not next week. Not after discussion. Today. That single push, lightly delivered, makes Edward's stomach drop. Because urgency in royal business is rarely about scheduling. It's about momentum. It's about creating a sense of inevitability so no one has time to think, to question, to warn, to pull a thread that might unravel the entire tapestry. Edward doesn't respond with anger. He responds with stillness. He lets the softness hang in the air long enough for its threat to show itself. And when it does, his refusal becomes more than a decision. It becomes a signal that he is not buying what they're selling. The fallout is immediate, even if it stays behind closed doors. Emergency meetings are called with Abbey officials, not in the grand rooms where tradition likes to breathe, but But in tighter spaces where voices drop and words cut cleaner, there is no shouting, because shouting would imply uncertainty. Instead, there are questions that sound like prayer and feel like interrogation. Who requested this? Who authorized the channel? Who promised what? The Abbey is an institution of ceremony, but in that moment it moves like a fortress, quiet, rigid, defensive, and Edward stands at the center of it, aware that he has just forced people to choose sides without ever asking them to. That's when Camilla's circle shifts tactics. If they can't secure the visit, they can isolate the obstacle. Edward starts hearing the phrase that always appears when power is threatened. Loyalty. Subtle, poisonous. As if loyalty is proven by obedience rather than principle, as if protecting the institution is betrayal of the person. Questions begin to ripple outward. Why is Edward resisting? Who is influencing him? What is he hiding? And the most dangerous part is how quickly those questions can become a narrative, because in the royal family, suspicion spreads faster than truth. Once the word disloyal touches someone, it clings. Edward knows that. That's why his warning lands with such finality, spoken once and never repeated. Once the image exists, it can't be undone. Once the Abbey is used as a stamp, you can't recall it without looking like you're tearing at the very fabric of the monarchy. Once Camilla is framed in that sacred space, every future confrontation becomes uglier, every future boundary becomes harder, and every private doubt becomes a public embarrassment. In that single line, Edward isn't just refusing a visit, he's exposing the real objective behind it. Not prayer, not tradition, permanence. But Edward doesn't just deny access, he reveals why Camilla wanted the Abbey so badly, and the atmosphere turns dangerous. Edward explains what most people never consider. Westminster Abbey is not just a place of worship, it is a royal stamp. It is where legitimacy is staged, remembered and sanctified in the public imagination. Who is seen there, who is welcomed, who is permitted near certain memorials, those details become history. And Edward believes Camilla's access wasn't about faith at all. It was about anchoring her story into the Abbey's meaning so tightly that challenging her later would feel like attacking the nation itself. That's the part the public never gets to hear, because the public is fed the softer language. A spiritual visit, a private moment, a respectful tradition. But Edward has lived long enough inside the machine to recognize when reverence is being used like velvet over steel. He insists there are boundaries in that place, some written, some sacred and unwritten, and the most dangerous boundaries are the ones no one admits exist, because admitting them would expose how carefully the monarchy manufactures permanence. Then the first crack appears. A small mistake. A trail, something routed through the wrong hands, a detail shared too widely, a timing note that shouldn't have been in writing at all. And suddenly Edward is no longer dealing with a vague request, he is staring at what looks like a planned camera moment, curated down to the angle of legacy. Not a prayer. A picture. Not faith. Positioning, he senses a looming clock too. An upcoming date that would cement the imagery forever. The kind of day that gets logged and replayed until it becomes how it has always been. And the more he sees it, the clearer it becomes. Once that image exists, it can't be undone. Sophie feels the danger from a different angle. She isn't thinking about strategy first, she's thinking about backlash. Denying a queen access, even quietly, sounds like sacrilege to people who don't understand what's happening beneath the surface. She fears the public will read it as cruelty, as pettiness, as disunity. Edward hears her, but he can't unsee what he's seen. Because this isn't a simple yes or no. It's a choice between temporary discomfort and permanent surrender. And while Edward is still measuring the consequences, Camilla's response arrives without ever arriving. She doesn't need to scream to win. Her power is quieter, and that's what makes it terrifying. Meetings get rescheduled. Friendly faces turn cautious. Calls that used to connect instantly begin filtering through assistants with rehearsed apologies. Patronage conversations suddenly require review. Edward feels it in the small humiliations first, then in the bigger ones, the way his relevance is gently questioned, the way his world starts to shrink as if the palace itself is trying to train him back into obedience. Anne recognizes it immediately. She calls it the counter-game. When you can't force someone to obey, you tighten their air until compliance feels like relief. Her advice is brutal in its simplicity: stay united. Speak less, move faster, and assume surveillance. Because the most dangerous pressure isn't public. It's social. It's the quiet intimidation that makes a man doubt his own footing. Edward's fear isn't for himself anymore. It's for his family's standing, for the collateral damage, for the possibility that one refusal could turn into a lifetime of consequences. But Edward's eyes harden, because he anticipated this. He prepared for it. He didn't walk into the Abbey fight without expecting the palace to strike back in whispers and schedules and silence. And just when everyone expects him to retreat into quiet duty, he does the opposite. He prepares to escalate. This is where it stops being polite and becomes personal. Edward doesn't just deny access, he draws a boundary around the crown's most sacred ground, and the act of drawing it costs him more than he expected. Sophie urges caution, trying to keep the temperature down, trying to protect them from the humiliation of looking like they've rejected a queen. But Edward hears what caution has become inside these walls, fear dressed as diplomacy. He refuses to let Westminster Abbey become a stage for legitimacy by optics, refuses to let stone and silence do the work of rewriting history. And when he finally says it calm, controlled and devastating, it lands like a slap across the room. This isn't devotion, it's strategy. He frames it as protection of legacy, not cruelty. But his voice carries the weight of something older than protocol: pride, duty, and the quiet heartbreak of realizing he has to fight people he once tried to accommodate. Sophie watches him with a kind of dread that isn't disagreement, it's foresight. Because she can already see the headlines that will never mention boundaries or sacred ground. They will say obstruction, petty, disloyal. And Edward knows that too. That's what makes his choice feel like a sacrifice. He isn't blind to backlash, he's choosing it. Because the alternative is surrender that can never be reversed. Anne backs him without hesitation, and that support is a shock in itself, because Anne doesn't waste loyalty on sentiment. She explains why the boundary matters long-term, why an Abbey image isn't a harmless photograph, but a permanent stamp, something that turns a contested position into an untouchable one. She tells Edward the truth no one else will. Once Camilla is anchored there, every future challenge will look like an attack on the nation, not a dispute inside a family. And in that cold clarity, a private pact forms: Edward, Anne, Sophie, and a small circle of key allies who understand that silence isn't neutrality anymore. Silence is surrender. But the moment Edward draws that line, Camilla stops playing gentle. She doesn't argue. She doesn't plead. She moves like a shadow: no warning, no public confrontation, just consequences that feel impossible to explain. Doors close that used to be open. Calls that used to connect become filtered. Meetings shift without apology. Friendly faces become cautious, then distant, then absent. It is soft retaliation with hard edges, staff reassigned, calendars altered, patronages suddenly under review, access tightening overnight as if the palace itself is quietly shrinking Edward's world until obedience feels like relief. Sophie panics because the cost is immediate, and worse, it's invisible. You can't fight what you can't name. You can't accuse someone of making your friends go cold. You can't stand at a lectern and explain why a corridor suddenly feels hostile. But Anne is brutal in her calm. You're already in the fire. That line doesn't comfort, it clarifies. And it forces Edward to accept something that turns his fear into resolve. The goal isn't to punish him privately. It's to stain him publicly. Then comes the real strike, a rumour designed with surgical cruelty. A story that makes Edward look disloyal, bitter, unfit anything except what he truly is. It doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to spread. Neutrals hear it and choose silence to stay safe. Allies hesitate because they don't want to be contaminated by association. Edward's reputation begins to erode in real time, not through facts, but through atmosphere, through the poisonous suggestion that his refusal wasn't principled, it was personal. And somewhere behind all of it, a public moment is being prepared, a polished assertion of dominance meant to lock Camilla's narrative into place, while Edward is made to look like the unstable obstacle. Edward's restraint hardens into something colder, because now he understands the game. This was never only about Abbey access. It was about control of the story, control of the symbols, control of what the nation is allowed to believe. And when Edward finally speaks again, it isn't with regret, it's with intent. He admits he anticipated this, and he has evidence, something tangible, something clean that could flip the narrative instantly and expose the plan behind the piety. Because Edward isn't just denying Abbey access anymore, he's about to expose why Camilla wanted that door opened in the first place. Edward prepares a strike so severe it doesn't just threaten Camilla, it threatens the entire royal machine that protects her. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because for the first time, this isn't just a family quarrel dressed up in tradition. This is an endgame. Sophie feels the collateral damage before anyone else dares to say it out loud. Charities, patronages, public trust, the fragile belief that the crown is above the ugliness. One wrong move and everything burns. But Anne's voice cuts through the fear with cold clarity. The illusion of unity is already dying, and the truth is the only way to save what's left. In that moment, Camilla is forced toward a choice she never expected to face: step back quietly, or risk a public unraveling that could stain the Abbey itself. A clock is ticking now, louder than any argument. An upcoming Abbey moment hangs over them like a deadline written in stone. The kind of date that would cement imagery permanently, an image that would outlive apologies, outlive denials, outlive even the people involved. Edward understands the brutality of that reality. Once the picture exists, it becomes history. Once the Abbey is used, it can't be unused. That's why his plan isn't emotional chaos. It's coordinated steps, controlled leaks that expose motive without exposing the vulnerable internal pressure that forces hands without forcing panic. Symbolic refusals that signal boundaries the public can finally feel. It is protection of legacy, yes, but it is also personal, because Edward knows what it costs to stay quiet when silence becomes permission. Then the day arrives, and the moment hits like thunder because it isn't announced, it's felt. Edward stands firm, the boundary unbroken, and every person there understands what that means. Holy ground has been protected from the wrong hands. No speech is needed. The refusal itself is the statement. The symbolism becomes heavier than words: positioning, silence, and a door that does not open, carrying more power than any press release ever could. Camilla's expression stays controlled, almost flawless, but the threat behind it is unmistakable. The kind of control that isn't peace, it's restraint. The kind of restraint that promises consequences. Sophie doesn't flinch, and that becomes the shock factor. Not because she is fearless, but because she refuses to be broken in front of the very people who want her to crack. She holds herself steady while everything around her tries to pull her apart: public perception, private fear, the old expectation that women in this system absorb the damage quietly to keep the men standing. Anne doesn't soften either. She stands like a wall, not defending Edward with tenderness but with certainty, as if daring anyone to pretend this is a misunderstanding. And inside that stillness, Edward's decisive stance stuns the insiders most of all, because they expected him to retreat into quiet duty the moment the pressure surged. Instead, he has chosen the harder path: no more quiet obedience, no more polite surrender disguised as harmony. And then there is the king's silence, the loudest sound of all. Because in that silence lies the question that haunts everyone watching. Who is he protecting? Is he containing Edward to stop the institution from bleeding? Or is he protecting Camilla to preserve the appearance of stability at any cost? No one can read him, not fully, not in that moment. His role remains unclear, and that uncertainty is its own kind of terror. Because the Crown doesn't just decide outcomes with words, it decides them with what it refuses to say. Camilla's counterstrike is implied quiet, strategic, inevitable. Not a public explosion, but reputation warfare and social pressure that can ruin a person without leaving fingerprints. Edward knows it's coming. He can feel it in the shifting faces, the sudden caution, the way people avoid committing to either side. Neutrals choose silence to stay safe. Allies hesitate because they fear becoming collateral. But Edward's message has already been delivered with brutal simplicity. The Abbey will not be used. Not as a stage. Not as a stamp. Not as a stamp. Not as a weapon. And the outcome isn't fully shown, not yet. That's the cruelest part. Because the damage is already permanent, even without a dramatic finale. Relationships have cracked in ways they can't be repaired. Lines have been drawn where no lines existed before. A pact has formed under threat, and the very act of forming it changes the future. Someone close to the king may still try to intervene, to stop Edward before the next move lands, before the truth spills into daylight. But Edward's eyes say what his mouth doesn't. One detail could change everything. One detail could flip the narrative instantly. One detail could force the palace to admit what it has been hiding behind tradition and ceremony. And just when the palace thinks it can bury this one final twist surfaces, because the Abbey was never the prize. It was the proof. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.